A $300 million radar system built to track incoming ballistic missiles was reduced to a smoking crater in the Jordanian desert, and satellite photographs taken from space confirmed it within days. This was not a rumor. This was not propaganda from state television. This was commercial satellite imagery, independently reviewed by CNN, later confirmed by a United States official speaking to Bloomberg. The ANTPY-2 radar at Muwafaq Salti Air Base, the beating heart of a terminal high-altitude area defense battery, sat inside a fortified American installation that had hosted more than 50 fighter jets on its tarmac. 2 craters, each 13 feet wide, appeared in the sand beside it. The radar, split across 5 40-foot trailers, was gone. All of it. Destroyed or seriously damaged beyond operational use in the opening days of a war that most of the world is still struggling to fully understand. That single radar was not an isolated incident. It was the first domino in what analysts are now calling one of the most successful campaigns of precision degradation against American military infrastructure in modern history. And the country responsible was not a global superpower with stealth bombers and hypersonic weapons. It was Iran, using drones that cost as little as $20,000 apiece, against radar systems worth hundreds of millions, sometimes billions of dollars. If you have spent any time following military news over the past several months, you have probably heard fragments of this story, but very few people have connected the dots into a single, coherent picture of just how badly the United States military's early warning and detection network across the Middle East was torn apart in a matter of weeks. So, let's walk through exactly what happened, how it happened, and why it matters far beyond the borders of Iran, Jordan, Qatar, and the Gulf states. To understand the radar story, you first have to understand how this war began. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated surprise attack on Iran. In the first 12 hours alone, close to 900 individual strikes hit targets across the country. This was not a limited, symbolic operation. It was framed publicly as a preemptive campaign to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, cripple its ballistic missile capability, and eliminate the senior leadership of the Islamic Republic. And in that opening wave, it succeeded in one of its most audacious goals. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Dozens of other senior officials died alongside him. Within days, Khamenei's son, Mojtaba, had been installed by Iran's Assembly of Experts as the new supreme leader, thrust into control of a nation that had just watched its government's head cut off in real time. For a brief moment, it looked like a swift, decisive victory. American officials described a campaign that had crippled Iran's capacity to respond. But wars rarely follow the script drawn up in the opening act, and Iran's retaliation, when it came, was not the disorganized, easily intercepted barrage that many expected. It was methodical, and it was aimed squarely at the sensors, radars, and detection systems that form the backbone of American air and missile defense across the entire region. Here's the part that deserves your full attention, because it is the part almost nobody is talking about in mainstream coverage. Iran's military strategists appear to have made a calculated decision early in the war. Rather than trying to overwhelm American missile defenses with sheer volume, the kind of brute force saturation attack that dominated headlines during the shorter 2025 conflict, Iran shifted towards something far more surgical. It began hunting for the radars themselves, because if you destroy the eyes of an air defense network, it does not matter how many interceptors you have sitting in a battery. You cannot shoot down what you cannot see coming. Within the first 4 days of the war, Iranian forces struck what analysts now describe as virtually every American military base, or every location from which American aircraft were operating, across the entire Gulf region. This was not a scattershot campaign. Video footage and satellite analysis, conducted after the fact, revealed a consistent pattern. Strike after strike targeted radar installations and communications infrastructure specifically, rather than barracks, fuel depots, or runways, though plenty of that was hit as well. At Al Jufair Base in Bahrain, 2 radomes housing AN/GSC-52B satellite communication systems were destroyed by single-use Shahed-2 attack drones. At Camp Arifjan in Kuwait, at least 3 radomes were destroyed in a similar fashion, alongside damage to structures connected to satellite communications equipment at the Ali Al Salam base. At Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, strikes hit an area previously used for satellite communications in a zone where an AN/TPY-2 radar had once been deployed. But the most devastating individual loss came in Qatar. Somewhere in that small Gulf nation sat the only AN/FPS-132 phased array radar located outside the borders of the United States itself. This is not a minor piece of equipment. The AN/FPS-132 is a massive, fixed early warning radar system, the kind of asset that takes years to build and cannot simply be replaced by ordering a new one off a factory floor. It was part of a broader haul that, according to reporting compiled by Military Watch magazine, added up to $2.7 billion worth of high-value radar systems destroyed by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in a single coordinated campaign $2.7 billion. That figure includes the Qatar radar, 2 AN/TPY-2 radars in Jordan and the United Arab Emirates, and a collection of lower-value radar systems hit at facilities scattered across the region. Let that sink in for a moment, because the scale of that number only becomes meaningful when you compare it against the cost of what was used to achieve it. The drone that reportedly took out the AN/TPY-2 radar in Jordan cost somewhere between $20,000 and $60,000, depending on the exact model used. Even the larger AN/FPS-117 radar destroyed near Al-Qaizam Airport in Saudi Arabia, a $20 million system with a detection range of 460 kilometers, was taken out using the same category of cheap, single-use attack drone. This is the story underneath the story. This war has revealed, in brutal and undeniable terms, a fundamental cost asymmetry that should worry military planners far beyond the borders of the Middle East. A nation can now spend tens of thousands of dollars to destroy assets worth tens or hundreds of millions. That math does not favor whoever holds the expensive equipment. The human and operational toll extended well beyond radars alone. At Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, roughly 80 miles southeast of Riyadh, an Iranian strike destroyed much of the back end of an E-3 Sentry aircraft, one of the airborne warning and control system planes that the United States Air Force relies on to manage battlespace awareness, using its onboard radar and data links. Images verified by NBC News show the tail of the aircraft lying at an angle on the ground, surrounded by debris. Several American service members were injured in that same strike. The E-3 Sentry is not a small piece of the puzzle. The AWACS fleet carries the largest airborne radars in the world, and the United States had deployed the bulk of its global operational E-3 fleet to the Middle East and Europe in the lead-up to this war, precisely because ground-based radar coverage in the region was expected to be under threat. Losing one of these aircraft on the ground before it ever had the chance to take off and do its job was a symbolic and practical blow rolled into one. Andreas Krieg, a senior lecturer at King's College London's School of Security Studies, put it plainly in comments given to NBC News. Iran, he said, is gradually eating away at the network of early warning systems that the United States built over decades in the region. And he made a point that deserves repeating, because it captures the deeper strategic logic behind Iran's targeting choices. Each individual radar or interceptor system that goes down might seem replaceable on its own. But collectively, as the losses accumulate, the entire architecture of detection and defense across the region begins to fray. You're not just losing pieces of hardware one at a time. You are losing the connective tissue that allows all the other pieces of hardware to function as a coordinated system. This is what military analysts mean when they talk about targeting the kill chain rather than individual weapons. A modern air defense network is not a single wall you either break through or don't. It is a chain of sensors, radars, command centers, data links, and interceptors, all of which have to work together in sequence for a single incoming missile or drone to be detected, tracked, identified, and destroyed. Break any link in that chain, the entire sequence can fail, even if every other piece of hardware in the system remains perfectly intact. Iran's campaign, according to the pattern of strikes documented across Jordan, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, appears to have been designed with exactly this logic in mind. Rather than trying to destroy the United States military outright, an objective that would be virtually impossible given the overwhelming disparity in total military strength, Iran instead aimed to create systemic friction, slow everything down, blind key sensors, force the entire kill chain to operate with degraded information. Even a partially blinded air defense network becomes dramatically less effective and dramatically more expensive to operate because you have to compensate for missing radar coverage by burning through far more interceptors than you would otherwise need, guessing rather than tracking with precision. The base described in the most stark terms by investigative reporting is Camp Buehring, once one of the most critical logistical and staging hubs for American operations across the Gulf. After sustained missile and drone attacks compromised its operational viability, the base was described as a nearly empty, heavily damaged shell. American personnel and equipment were forced into a near-total evacuation. The specific loss of a $500 million radar system at that site was singled out by analysts as underscoring just how strategically significant the destruction of high-end detection capabilities has been in a region that depends so heavily on early warning to counter missile and drone threats. And the ripple effects did not stop with the radar hardware itself. With key installations no longer safe or operational, American personnel were dispersed into non-military facilities in the surrounding area. That kind of dispersal might sound like a reasonable defensive adaptation on the surface, but it introduces its own layer of vulnerability. Personnel scattered outside, protected military compounds, face greater challenges around force protection, intelligence security, and maintaining continuity of command, especially when an adversary has already demonstrated the surveillance and targeting capability to strike specific buildings with precision. There's a pattern worth naming directly here. because it represents a genuine shift in modern warfare doctrine, not just a single unlucky string of losses. For decades, American and Allied military planning around missile threats from adversaries like Iran assumed a volume-based doctrine on the other side. The expectation was that Iran would attempt to overwhelm defenses by firing large numbers of missiles simultaneously, hoping that sheer quantity would allow some percentage to slip through even the most sophisticated interception systems. That is largely what happened during the shorter 2025 conflict between Israel and Iran, when American and Israeli reporting focused heavily on interception rates and the sheer scale of missile barrages. But the 2026 campaign shows something different. It shows a transition toward a leaner, more cost-imposing form of warfare, one explicitly designed to identify the most expensive, hardest to replace nodes in an adversary's military architecture and destroy those specific nodes using the cheapest possible tools. This is precision-targeted, cost-imposition warfare. And it worked, at least in the narrow sense of achieving significant, verifiable damage to sensor and detection infrastructure that the United States had spent decades and untold billions of dollars building up across the region. It helps to understand exactly what these radar systems were supposed to do, because that context makes the losses land with even more weight. The AN/TPY-2 is not a generic piece of battlefield equipment. It is an X-band radar purpose built to detect and track ballistic missiles at extreme range, feeding targeting data directly into the THAAD interceptor system, so that a missile threat can be identified, classified, and engaged before it ever reaches its target. The AN/FPS-132 goes even further. It is a massive, fixed installation, part of the same family of early warning radar used to provide strategic missile warning coverage, the kind of system normally associated with defending against the most serious long-range threats a country can face. These are not systems you order in bulk from a catalog. Each one represents years of engineering, testing, and integration into a broader command and control network before it ever becomes operational. When you lose one, you're not simply losing a piece of equipment. You are losing years of accumulated capability that cannot be regenerated on any timeline shorter than years. It is also worth directly addressing why Iran was able to execute this campaign as effectively as it did, because the answer is not simply that Iranian drones are somehow more advanced than expected. Much of the explanation comes down to basic economics and basic geography. Radar installations, by their very design, cannot be easily hidden. They need clear lines of sight to function, which means they are typically positioned in open, exposed locations, often with minimal camouflage or hardened protection, because the assumption for decades was that any adversary capable of threatening them would have to do so with expensive, trackable, interceptable missiles fired from significant distances. Cheap, low-flying, hard-to-detect single-use drones essentially sidestep that entire defensive assumption. They do not need to punch through layered missile defenses from hundreds of miles away. They need only to get close enough, low enough, and quietly enough to reach a radar that was never designed to defend itself against that specific category of threat. In many ways, the American and Allied air defense network across the Gulf was built to stop yesterday's threat with extraordinary effectiveness, while remaining comparatively exposed to a cheaper, more modern threat that evolved faster than the defensive doctrine built to counter it. This is not the first time in recent memory that cheap drone technology has upended assumptions about expensive military hardware. Analysts studying the war in Ukraine have spent years documenting how relatively inexpensive drones reshaped battlefield tactics, sinking warships, destroying tanks, and forcing multi-billion-dollar militaries to rethink how they protect high-value assets. What makes the Gulf radar campaign distinct is the specificity of the targeting and the sheer concentration of high value, hard-to-replace sensor infrastructure that was hit in such a short window of time. This was not a diffuse campaign against generic military targets. It was a focused, sustained effort to blind an entire regional detection network, base by base, radar by radar, in the span of days rather than months. The financial and strategic consequences rippled outward almost immediately. With key THAAD and Patriot radar assets destroyed or degraded across multiple countries, the United States found itself needing to replace lost coverage rapidly in the middle of an active war. That meant pulling assets from elsewhere in the world. Reporting confirmed that Patriot air defense systems, along with their associated radars, began to be withdrawn from strategically critical forward positions in South Korea for redeployment to the Middle East. Read that sentence again, because its implications extend far beyond the immediate war zone. South Korea sits at the front line of one of the most tense and heavily armed borders on the planet, facing a nuclear-armed neighbor in North Korea. Pulling missile defense assets away from that theater, even temporarily, to plug gaps created by Iranian strikes on the other side of the world, represents a genuine strategic cost with long-term implications for American force posture in East Asia and for the confidence of allies in that region. This is the hidden price tag of losing radar coverage in one theater. It does not stay contained to that theater. It forces difficult trade-offs everywhere else American forces are deployed. There is also the matter of the interceptors themselves, separate from the radars that guide them. Each THAAD interceptor launch costs approximately $15.5 million. During the 11 days when THAAD and other systems were used intensively to defend Israeli airspace, the cost of that defense alone has been conservatively estimated at over $2.35 billion. Now factor in the much higher intensity and duration of Iranian strikes since the war began on February 28th, a campaign that stretched across 40 days of sustained combat before a ceasefire took effect on April 8th. And you begin to understand why defense analysts describe the interceptor arsenal itself as likely being depleted at a considerably faster rate than originally planned. This creates a long-term challenge for American missile defense capability that extends well beyond the destruction of the radar systems themselves. It is not just that the eyes of the system were damaged. It is that the ammunition needed to act on whatever those eyes could still see was being consumed at an unsustainable pace. Faced with mounting equipment losses and a rapidly draining interceptor stockpile, the American defense industrial base scrambled to respond. Defense contractors, including Lockheed Martin and RTX Corporation, the very company whose radar and interceptor systems were being destroyed across the Gulf, met at the White House as the Pentagon pushed to accelerate weapons production. Following that meeting, President Trump stated publicly that the largest American defense manufacturing companies had agreed to expand production of what he described as exquisite class weaponry. That phrase is worth sitting with for a moment because it inadvertently captures the entire problem at the heart of this story. Exquisite class weaponry, by definition, is expensive, complex, time-consuming to manufacture, and difficult to replace quickly. You cannot scale production of a system like the AN/TPY-2 radar the way you can scale production of a drone that costs $20,000 and can be built in bulk from commercially available components. The fundamental mismatch between how quickly expensive systems can be destroyed versus how quickly they can be rebuilt is not something that a single White House meeting and a public pledge to expand manufacturing can immediately solve. The political fallout inside the United States has been just as significant as the military and financial consequences. Investigative reporting, compiled from satellite imagery, battlefield forensics, and interviews with American officials and regional sources, found that at least 16 separate United States military installations across the Middle East sustained significant damage from coordinated Iranian missile and drone strikes in early 2026. That number, 16 bases, stands in direct tension with public statements from Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, who had characterized Iranian retaliatory capacity as having been largely neutralized. The gap between that official narrative and the operational reality, documented by satellite imagery, created what reporting described as an immediate credibility gap in strategic communications coming out of the Pentagon. Representative Pat Ryan publicly questioned command accountability over the discrepancy and demanded consequences for military leadership. When elected officials start openly challenging the Pentagon's own account of battlefield damage, using publicly available satellite evidence as their proof, that tells you something important about how significant this radar destruction campaign actually was, regardless of how it was initially described to the American public. There's a striking irony buried in all of this that deserves to be said plainly. In the years leading up to this war, American strategic planning around Iran had focused heavily on offense, on the ability to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, missile production sites, and leadership targets with speed and precision. That offensive planning proved effective in the war's opening hours, when nearly 900 strikes hit Iranian targets and killed the country's supreme leader within the first day of combat. But offense and defense are not the same discipline, and success in one does not guarantee success in the other. While enormous resources and attention had gone into building the capability to strike Iran, the defensive infrastructure meant to protect American forces and bases across the region from Iranian retaliation had, by comparison, quietly accumulated vulnerabilities that nobody fully reckoned with until Iranian drones started finding them one base at a time. It is a pattern that shows up again and again across military history. The side that wins the opening exchange does not automatically win the war that follows. An offensive success can sometimes mask defensive weaknesses that only become visible once the other side gets to respond. That credibility gap between official Pentagon statements and the verified reality on the ground deserves a bit more scrutiny because it is not a small detail. When a sitting defense secretary publicly describes an adversary's retaliatory capacity as having been largely neutralized, and independent satellite imagery subsequently confirms that 16 separate American installations sustained significant damage, that is not a minor communications misstep. It shapes how Congress allocates resources, how allied nations calibrate their own trust in American security guarantees, and how the American public understands the actual state of a war their country is fighting. Representative Pat Ryan's public questioning of command accountability was not an isolated partisan jab. It reflected a legitimate structural problem, one where the fog of war the natural incentive to project strength during an active conflict, and the genuine difficulty of assessing battle damage in real time combined to produce an official narrative that lagged well behind the documented facts on the ground. Future historians studying this war will likely spend as much time analyzing that credibility gap as they spend analyzing the radar strikes themselves, because trust in official military assessments is itself a strategic asset, one that erodes quickly and rebuilds slowly. It is worth pausing here to address a broader question, because this is not simply a story about hardware losses in a distant war. It is a story about what modern warfare increasingly looks like, and about vulnerabilities that extend well beyond the specific countries and bases involved in this particular conflict. The United States has spent decades building an air and missile defense architecture across the Middle East that assumes a certain baseline of security for its most expensive, most technologically advanced sensor systems. Those systems were designed, built, and deployed under the assumption that they would primarily need to defend against large, expensive, relatively slow-moving threats, ballistic missiles fired from significant distances, the kind of threat that justified massive investment in correspondingly massive, expensive detection infrastructure. What this war demonstrated, in stark and expensive terms, is that the same billion-dollar radar system built to detect an incoming ballistic missile from hundreds of miles away can be destroyed by a drone that costs less than a nice used car, if that drone can simply fly close enough and detonate on target. This is not a uniquely Iranian innovation either, though Iran's execution of this strategy across the Gulf theater has been particularly well documented and particularly effective. It reflects a broader shift that has been building across multiple conflicts over the past several years, one where cheap, mass-producible drone technology increasingly threatens to outpace the economics of traditional, exquisite military hardware. Every major military power on Earth is watching what happened to American radar infrastructure across the Gulf in 2026, and drawing their own conclusions about what it means for their own expensive, hard-to-replace detection and defense systems. If a regional power like Iran, operating under sanctions with a fraction of the defense budget of the United States, can inflict $2.7 billion in verified radar damage using drones that individually cost less than $60,000, that is a lesson that will not be lost on military planners from Beijing to Moscow to countries far smaller and less resourced than either of those two. There's also a deeper question embedded in all of this about the nature of deterrence itself. For decades, American military strategy in the Middle East has rested partly on the assumption that overwhelming technological superiority creates a deterrent effect. The logic goes that adversaries will hesitate to strike American assets because the cost of retaliation and the near certainty of losing any direct military confrontation outweighs whatever they might hope to achieve. But cost imposition warfare, the kind Iran appears to have executed here, does not require winning a direct military confrontation in the traditional sense. It does not require Iran to defeat the United States military or even come close to matching its overall capability. It only requires identifying the most expensive, least replaceable components of that military's regional infrastructure and finding a way to destroy them cheaply. That is a fundamentally different calculation than the one traditional deterrence theory was built around, and it suggests that raw technological and budgetary superiority alone may no longer be sufficient to prevent significant, embarrassing, and strategically meaningful losses. None of this happened in a vacuum, and it is worth briefly placing this radar destruction campaign within the broader arc of the war itself, because the story did not end with a tidy ceasefire and a return to normal operations. After 40 days of sustained combat, a conditional ceasefire was declared on April 8, 2026, with talks mediated by Pakistan continuing in the aftermath. But that ceasefire did not resolve the underlying tensions, and by mid-April, the United States had launched a counter-blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, targeting all ships attempting to reach Iranian ports. Iran, in turn, threatened military action if that blockade was not lifted, while President Trump threatened extensive additional attacks on Iranian infrastructure if Iran did not reopen the strait to normal shipping. Even months after the initial radar strikes, tensions continued to flare. Reporting from late July described Iran firing on multiple commercial vessels in the strait, testing the limits of the memorandum of understanding that had been reached in June to try to end the broader conflict and reopen shipping lanes. In other words, the radar network that Iran degraded so effectively in the opening weeks of the war remains relevant today, because the underlying conflict it was built to help manage has never fully resolved. Stepping back from the individual strikes and dollar figures, what should you actually take away from all of this? First, and most simply, verify what you hear, especially when it comes to official statements about military success or failure during an active conflict. The gap between what Pentagon officials initially described and what independent satellite imagery, journalists, and eventually American officials themselves confirmed was significant. Investigative reporting and open-source satellite analysis played an outsized role in establishing the actual scale of radar losses across the Gulf, often ahead of, and in direct contradiction to official statements. That is a pattern worth watching for in any future conflict, not just this one. Second, pay attention to the economics of modern warfare, not just the headline weapon systems. The most consequential story from this entire campaign is not any single radar, however expensive or strategically important. It is the ratio between what it costs to destroy something and what it costs to build it in the first place. A $20,000 drone destroying a $500 million radar system is not just a tactical victory in one battle. It is a preview of the kind of asymmetric warfare that increasingly defines conflicts between technologically mismatched adversaries. And it is a problem that money alone cannot easily solve, because you cannot outmanufacture an enemy that only needs a tiny fraction of your budget to inflict comparable damage. Third, understand that losses in one theater do not stay contained to that theater. The withdrawal of Patriot systems from South Korea to cover gaps created by Iranian strikes in the Middle East is a perfect illustration of how interconnected global military posture actually is. A war fought across the Gulf region had direct, measurable consequences for American defense capability on the Korean Peninsula, thousands of miles away, simply because the total pool of available radar and interceptor assets is finite, and Iran's campaign forced difficult choices about where those limited assets would ultimately be deployed. And finally, recognize that this story, as dramatic and consequential as it has been, is very likely a preview of things to come, rather than an isolated anomaly. The core lesson of Iran's radar destruction campaign across the Gulf in 2026 is not really about Iran specifically, or even about the United States specifically. It is about what happens when cheap, mass-producible technology meets expensive, hard-to-replace infrastructure in a world where more and more actors, state and non-state alike, have access to exactly that kind of cheap technology. The radar network that took decades and untold billions of dollars to build across the Middle East was significantly degraded in a matter of weeks. That is not a story that ends when this particular ceasefire holds or fails to hold in the Strait of Hormuz. It is a story that every military planner around the world is now studying closely, because the next version of this exact scenario could play out almost anywhere, against almost anyone, and the side holding the more expensive, more sophisticated equipment is no longer guaranteed to come out ahead.